Hi, my name is Dr. Janne Liburd. I'm from the University of Southern Denmark, where I'm an associate professor, and I'm also the director of the Center for Tourism, Innovation and Culture. This module is entitled Understanding the Concept of Sustainable Tourism Development, and I'm going to show you the outline of the presentation by clicking here. First, I'm going to talk about the conceptual origins. What is sustainable development actually? Where does it come from? And given those different notions, how does sustainable development actually relate to tourism? I'm going to talk about the differences between sustainable tourism and sustainable tourism development, whether sustainability is a process or whether it's a goal that can be achieved. And that leads me to some critical reflections upon also the challenges and opportunities for the future. At the end of the presentation, I've made a slide with some literature suggestions and how you can proceed to learn more. Now, the antecedents to the concept of sustainability are often attributed to Western environmental movements. It includes the UN conference in Stockholm in 1972, and it includes also very often cited publications such as those I've listed, or you can see some of in the right hand of the screen. Rachel Carson's Silent Spring is much quoted for actually bringing to the forefront of attention, in particular in the US, how the use of pesticides impacted on the environment, and therefore by human beings consuming those products, it changed how nature worked and it changed our gene pool as well. And her prediction is that if we continue polluting the way we were, eventually there will be no birds singing, and hence we will experience a silent spring. Hardin in 1968 wrote in The Tragedy of the Commons that ruin is the destination to which all men rush, each pursuing their own self-interest or best interest. And he says that freedom in the commons bring ruin to all. So his concern is that the fact that nature is accessible to all in most cases, we tend to self-maximize and therefore again contribute to the overall degradation, because we're concerned mostly for our own and immediate peers and families rather than society overall or nature in and by itself. So what these publications and the different environmental movements and conferences have actually done is that they've linked development, the notion of development, very much to that of the environment. The way that we use nature has a direct impact and also informs contemporary notions of how we can develop our world, societies, human beings, and so on in general in a more harmonious relationship than has previously been the case. This was also acknowledged at the UN level, and the United Nations in less than a decade actually put together 3 different conferences. This was in the period between 1977 and 1984, and they were all those 3 commissions were chaired by former prime ministers. The first of which was Willy Brandt, who is the German Bundeskanzler. Also Olof Palme, who was the president in Sweden, and then lastly Gro Harlem Brundtland, who was the prime minister in Norway. And each of those reports have very strong political influence from labor governments or social democratic ideologies. And they have actually put together, these 3 commissions put together and informed what became the Brundtland Report, or this is how it's very often referred to, which was written by the World Commission on the Environment and Development and published in 1987. Now, Brundtland in particular uses the recommendations from the 2 previous commissions by Brandt and Olof Palme. So their concerns about not only development but also the growing inequalities between the northern and the southern hemisphere, about security threats, and again remember this is in a period of time in the 80s where there was also a nuclear arms race going on between the US and Russia. So all of these different influences actually comes together in the Brundtland Report entitled Our Common Future, where these problems are integrated. Now, their recommendation is not to see sustainable development as something that hinders growth, because the approach is still, and this is very important, that economic growth and continued economic growth is key to actually securing long-term benefits. But it must be done through international cooperation, strategic long-term planning, and not at the expense of the natural resource base, and thereby also beyond institutional and national concerns. It's a holistic approach to development, in other words. The definition that they propose is that sustainable development is development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. And that means that it's also a telic concept, where it offers not only a present view or an immediate view, but is very much concerned for the long-term aspects of development, not only within the current generation, but between generations as well. And in essence, you can actually argue very easily that the generality of the concept makes it very easy to embrace as well, because it hinges on principles of wise use or balanced use of natural resources, and doing so with a view to conservation and stewardship. Very interestingly, when you look at the report being a UN document, there's been very few proposals in the world that was effortlessly embraced as a very good idea. It's also, again, a very simple concept. It's a good idea to make things last and not just use them for our own purposes. So regardless of whether we were looking at governments within the UN system or non-government organizations or different environmental movements and so on, and including academics, it was met by very, very positive praises and support overall. But unfortunately, and it's quite important to notice also, a lot of these very positive remarks have been framed within what is traditionally known as the first world, or in a developing world context. But unfortunately, both the issues of ethics and equality in between generations and across generations have not received very much attention, not in the literature either, as we should talk about in a second, that deals with the concept of sustainability. So, as I mentioned, the approval is very easy across all sectors, across institutions and different groups in society, because of the generality of the concept. However, one thing is actually saying that this is a good idea, another is certainly to practice these principles, to implement the laudable principles in practice. Now, interestingly enough, because it is the Brundtland report is a holistic approach, it doesn't mention any specific sectors or industries. And even though tourism has a very direct interest in preserving the resource base on which it depends, tourism is not mentioned in the Brundtland report. And strangely enough, you may argue as well, it actually took up until 1995 from the publication again of the Brundtland report in 1987, but up until 1995 before the travel and tourism industry actively reacted. And the document that came out in 1995 was a joint document based on what was known as the Rio Earth Summit. And here an Agenda 21 was formulated, or after the Rio Earth Summit, this Agenda 21 directly targeting the travel and tourism industry was formulated in collaboration between the World Travel and Tourism Council, the World Tourism Organization and the Earth Council. And as you can see from the description on the slide, again, there's an idea that it is about improving the current quality of life, not just for tourists, but also for host communities. And it's also about maintaining the resource base, or the quality of the environment on which the host community and the visitor both depend. One could perhaps be an ironic observer and say that, well, this is probably because we feel bad about mass tourism. From Jafar Jafari's platforms, or ideas of academic platforms that have dominated tourism research and shifted within tourism research over the last few decades, In the 1980s, academic researchers were very interested in looking at tourism's impacts. And because of the size of mass tourism and because of the history of pollution, where you can say many of tourism's current problems are actually made in the past, well, these have been very, very well documented in the so-called impact literature. Mass tourism is standardized by package holidays, and they appear to not only capture all these societal ills such as pollution and the growing disparities between North and South, but it meant that eventually there was a call also for alternatives and need for changing current practices toward more sound and responsible stewardship. And a lot of these different types of tourism or alternative tourisms that were seen as being contradictory or a departure from the traditional form of mass tourism were either labeled eco-tourism, nature tourism, sound, alternative, you have it. Anything small and green was seen automatically as being a better form of tourism than mass tourism. Within the literature of sustainable tourism development, initially the idea of ecotourism was seen as being very much the idea of how sustainable tourism development could be implemented. And if we look at one of the definitions again on sustainable tourism development, which is provided by the UNWTO in 2001, they talk about sustainable tourism development as meeting the needs of present tourist and host regions while protecting and enhancing opportunities for the future. Well, I guess you can recognize the wording of that from the Brundtland report. That's not very different. However, it's a very anthropocentric approach initially. Then they move on to say that sustainable tourism is envisaged as leading to management of all resources in such a way that economic, social, and aesthetic needs can be fulfilled while maintaining cultural integrity, essential ecological processes, biological diversity, and life support systems. So here we actually see an introduction also of the other principles of sustainability, which is not just about the continuing economic growth, but it's also about social and cultural and environmental principles. However, when I look at those two, and this was also my reason for highlighting the two definitions, which are provided by the same organization, sustainable tourism cannot be the same as sustainable tourism development. They are actually two very, very different things. Now, sustainable tourism is very much centered on the viability of tourism and balancing industry and environmental impacts. And sustaining tourism means that the management of the net productive value of the natural capital can be calculated in order to implement compensating resource replacement and substitution strategies. So you can find some kind of a trade-off. This is basically the argument in order to sustain the industry. The problem is, though, that if you look at it critically, when you're considering the tourism industry in isolation, its very activities and ways of operation may actually run contrary to larger sustainable development objectives of society. They can be noticed, for instance, in the notorious aspect of the industry's application of or use of low-skilled labor, a very low-wage structure, and also very long and unsociable working hours. Now, that can help sustain the industry, but it certainly runs counter to, for instance, quality of life and perhaps also gender equality. Gianni Moscato in 2008 have argued that thinking that tourism can be sustainable in its own right by referring to itself is actually an oxymoron, because tourism, of course, doesn't operate in isolation from the wider society and the environment in which it exists. So trying to isolate tourism really runs counter to the broader social and environmental and cultural and economic processes of sustainable development. Now, the other aspect that needs our critical attention is the claim that's often made to sustainable tourism as being something that has to be achieved, that it is simply a goal, it's a matter of setting a target that we want to be sustainable by, say, 2020. Again, if you argue that sustainability can be achieved over a period of time, it actually fails to understand that the very principles of the environment, of social and cultural issues, and of the economy are of course not static. So to think that somehow a group of people in a destination could agree that now this is our goal and this is what we want to achieve, and it cannot be changed because we want to achieve this goal, well, that of course undermines the whole understanding of both nature and culture and also the economy as being very, very dynamic. And I think if you reflect upon your own lives, that you would see perhaps a big difference between, you know, what the current generation wants and what the parent generation, their parents, wanted, right? And the changes that has happened over the years in terms of cultural preferences and economic diversification and so on. So to think that this can all come to an end, that we can agree that this is enough, I think is an oxymoron. So we need to acknowledge that these choices in lifestyle, in cultures, in our consumption patterns, they change over time, and therefore it doesn't make sense to talk about sustainability as a goal that can be achieved, but as a process of change and transformations that can lead to better management, because we think about development not just for ourselves in isolation, but across institutions, across sectors, and we look at both, again, the environmental, the sociocultural, and the economic principles in a holistic perspective when we're looking towards new developments. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit, very briefly, about complex adaptive systems, because it does have implications, and it makes sense when we talk about sustainable tourism development as a managerial philosophy, and the idea that we want to transform and develop towards doing better than what we have so far. And moving away from the very linear way of thinking that here we are today, and in 2020 this is where we need to be. The complex adaptive systems of complexity theory teaches us that the world is so much more different than that, and that there are ups and downs constantly, and there are a lot of non-linear dynamics that we need to take into account and be able to maneuver within. Now, Hollins in 1986 for the first time proposed this reclining figure 8, which is since adapted by Gunderson and his colleague. And you can see that based on the movements of the model, and those of you who are familiar also with Butler's 1980 theory about tourism area life cycles, that in the exploration stage we can actually see a tourism destination take off, then become consolidated over time based on visitation. And if there's no proactive measurements institutionalized, the destination will eventually start to decline because of pollution, overcrowding, and sociocultural inequalities and so on. But instead of Butler's model that basically ends there, or you'll have to have an upswing of some kind, what we can see in this system is that there's an opportunity to actually reorganize as the system changes. And these can be done, or these changes can be caused not just from within tourism, but are very much often from the larger sort of complexity surrounding tourism, meaning the world, which are beyond an individual industry's control. This could be impacts from the global financial crisis, it could be climate change, it could be natural-made catastrophes, whether they are tsunamis or hurricanes or earthquakes. All these different factors influence the tourism industry, but to a point where we have to adapt and to actually reorganize in order to maintain the system. And that also gives us opportunities for new innovations, introduction of new innovations within this network of very, very many different actors. So adaptive management of complex systems and translating that into tourism means that sustainable tourism development can be a way to actively adapt to all these changing futures, presents and futures, that the tourism industry occurs, because we need to bounce back. It needs to go through a period of release and reorganization in order again to produce viable outcomes. It also opens up for the opportunity through the idea that there are very many different actors within this network of the system, that stakeholders who have a direct and indirect vested interest in tourism can be involved, can participate as partners, so that through that the principles from sustainable development that I said before was grossly overlooked, namely that of inter and intra-generational equity, that they actually stand a chance here to be reintroduced and actively play into how things are done because of the partners that are involved, who are able to act as a unity or as competitors while they're trying to meet these challenges of sustainable tourism development. Now, it might sound complex, and it is, but I think what we need to do also is take it down a notch from the philosophical level to also look at the implementation issues and some of the challenges and opportunities ahead. Because if businesses are not confronted by consumers with concerted demands for more sustainable products or for sustainable tourism packages that can deliver on the overall aspects of sustainability in various destinations, it is of course also important that businesses need to understand that they can move away from sort of short-term orientation towards single bottom lines, toward long-term development, and also understanding the research need of the industry in order to sustain its future. That simply reproducing what is best practice elsewhere will not cut it in the long term. And again, we cannot keep exploiting the natural resource bases and perhaps even the human resource bases at the extent to which we are doing it at the current. The role of corporate social responsibility, or in the abbreviation here CSR, may perhaps lead us in a direction where the business case for tourism can be made through not only the industry itself, but the financiers, and including the pension funds, the various banks and investors, insurance companies also, who need to demonstrate a level of corporate social responsibility beyond the individual firm. So by having socially responsible investment schemes, this might be one way where you can see that you can actually optimize a firm's performance by reporting on not just a single economic bottom line, but on a triple bottom line of social, cultural, environmental and economic matters. Consumers, as I already indicated, of course, has a role too to be more concerned about driving this sustainability agenda, which can be done in different ways too, which I don't think we've exploited nearly enough. The role of new media and social media, of course, gives us an enormous opportunity and power as consumers to communicate different values-based messages or to recommend best practice to each other, not just within the previous sort of close circle of peers and friends and family, but on a global platform where views can be exchanged, where bad practices can be exposed, where other practices that are actually trying to adhere to the sustainability principles can be communicated. Governments have a role as well. They have the instruments when it comes to policy making. They have different tools of modern day governance in the 21st century that can put sustainability on the agenda. Again, it's a long-term perspective that's adapted, but that doesn't take away from the present, that obviously it should be important also to discuss, based on where we are today, what are the indicators we're going to be used in measuring the drive towards more sustainable practices or the transformation, so that we don't stray off in a different direction compared to where we actually thought we were setting out, which means that politicians who are looking for re-election don't have to wait 15 years. They're probably going to be out at that time anyway. But they will have measurements or tools that can document that, well, we have actually changed things. There are progress in right directions, or we were on the wrong course here based on what we've actually set out in our strategy for sustainable development and sustainable tourism development. So we need to actually return to that. But the act of regulating and documenting then becomes of crucial importance also. And that puts researchers and students into a particular role, because we need to constantly, of course, be critical about the concept as well, how it is interpreted, what it means in different contexts, how it is abused as well. And certainly in the tourism world, it is often also used to sort of greenwash normal everyday practices that are just suddenly portrayed as being more environmentally friendly because we're recycling towels. So the ongoing critical analysis should also be used to close the gap between scientists and researchers who produce knowledge and policymakers who actually apply this knowledge in order to secure a critical background and the necessary information to make informed decisions for tomorrow. I've posed a few review questions as well that has to do with this presentation. Talking about the difference between sustainable development, sustainable tourism development, also the difference between whether sustainability can be achieved or whether it is a process, a managerial philosophy, etc. The reclining figure 8, which is a little bit difficult to get your heads around sometimes, but I think it shows how we can actively adapt and manage when we are dealing with uncertain futures. And then last but not least, you can try to identify some of the drivers for sustainable tourism development and tease those out in further detail. I should invite you to use the blogging function that I have been provided to with this presentation, because as you can see, it gives you the opportunity to not just exchange views within sort of a traditional classroom setting, but with students and learners who are actually engaged with the best environment or community of learners who are all over the world. And this is also the very purpose of this Best in Sustainability series, to connect people across divides, and some of whom may never meet, in order to discuss some of these very, very important issues of the future. At the end, I want to refer you to a publication called Understanding the Sustainable Development of Tourism. My presentation is based on the first chapter, which I've written and which is published in this book edited by myself and Deborah Edwards. A range of articles have been listed also for your information. Some of them talk about the sort of public understanding. Others talk about social justice and equity, which I didn't touch upon today, but which is also, of course, looking at the power differences and the inequalities in tourism. That this is an important issue that's touched upon by Shellhorn. Jamal and Watt has a sort of a similar perspective, but looking at climate change instead, and the issue of community-based destination governance. Moscato has several presentations, several publications, but also a presentation in this series where she gives us different perspectives on sustainable tourism. In this context, I've listed her contribution to innovation. And a publication by Miller and Louise Twining-Ward from 2005, which is more explicit also on the idea of the transition towards sustainable tourism development, but in particular also deals very well with the notion of complex adaptive systems. And last but not least, a range of case studies that have been provided by Jack Carlson and Dick Butler from 2010. So thank you for your time, and best of luck and interest in sustainable tourism development, and I hope we'll see each other sometime. Otherwise, hopefully online, and I should look forward to also